So today we're jumping into a really fascinating and honestly pretty provocative argument. It's one that claims a huge pillar of modern science wasn't taken down by new evidence, but that it's been philosophically dismantled from the inside out. The central claim from this source isn't about finding new fossils or some groundbreaking DNA analysis. Nope. The argument is that Darwinism has basically collapsed under its own weight, that the very logic and the language it's built on are fundamentally flawed. Okay, that is a massive claim. So how in the world does this source get to such a dramatic conclusion? Well, the argument kind of unfolds in three main parts. And it all starts with the actual words the theory is built on. Right, so the core of this whole critique doesn't begin in a biology lab, but in a dictionary. It really hones in on the meaning of two super important terms, necessity and chance. Let's start with necessity. Now, the source argues that this word isn't really about some blind, impersonal force of nature. Instead, it claims necessity only makes sense when you're talking about a conscious being feeling compelled to do something. Like the necessity you feel to find shelter from a storm. That's a personal experience, not some cosmic law. And it's the same kind of reframing for the word chance. The source is saying that chance isn't just random static out there in the universe. It's simply a word we use to describe an action that doesn't have an intention behind it. In other words, chance can only mean something in a world where intention is also a possibility. And this brings us to a really key part of the whole argument, what the source calls a square of opposites. You've got freedom on one side, and its opposite is necessity. Then you have intention, and its opposite is chance. The really powerful conclusion here is that a universe driven by impersonal necessity and pure chance is a universe where genuine freedom and real intention can't actually exist. This whole deep dive into language doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. The argument gets even more intense when it targets the main word itself, evolution, which the author calls, and this is a quote, a semantic forgery. Why? Why such a strong term? Well, because the source points back to the word's etymology, its original roots. Evolution originally meant the unrolling of something that was already planned out, kind of like unrolling a scroll. It implied there was an inherent design and a purpose. The author's point is that modern theory co-opted the word while completely ditching its original teleological meaning. Okay, let's pivot to the source's historical argument and see how this all built. The author puts forward this really surprising origin story for Darwinism's core concepts. The author traces this whole lineage of ideas way, way back, thousands of years. It argues that it all starts in Homer's epic poetry, then gets turned into a philosophy by ancient Greek atomists, and finally, the source claims, it gets smuggled into modern science. And to make this really concrete, the source points us to Homer's Iliad. In the story, necessity, the Greek word is ananke, isn't some law of physics. It's a verb. It is the act of one hero, Diomedes, physically compelling another hero. It's an action that requires conscious people to happen. So here's the crucial point. The author argues that when the Greek atomists and much later Darwinism took these concepts, they just stripped them of their original context. They turned verbs into nouns. They took actions that happened between people and blew them up into these ultimate impersonal forces, what the source calls conceptual ghosts. All right, so if the theory has really collapsed under the weight of its own language and history, like the source is claiming, what's left? What's in its place? Well, first off, the source completely dismisses any attempt to try and merge Darwinism with theism. The argument's pretty simple. You can't build a new house on a foundation that's already gone through, and I quote, nuclear fission. If the core logic is shattered, any attempt to combine it with something else is just doomed from the start. So let's just pull this entire argument together for a second. The source claims that what you have is a theory built on flawed concepts, using a central term that actually contradicts its own origin, and with intellectual roots that trace all the way back to ancient mythology. For the author, this is just not a stable structure. But what's interesting is the source doesn't frame this conclusion as some kind of dead end. Not at all. It's actually presented as a new beginning. The collapse of this old framework, it argues, clears the way for a totally different view of the cosmos, one that can be understood as free, purposeful, and personal. And that leaves us with a final and pretty provocative question to chew on. This philosophical critique claims to tear down one view of the universe to make room for another. What the implications of that shift might actually be, well, that's something worth thinking about.